right, so in this section, we're going to do the introduction into metabolism. All right. Key things that we want to look at in this early part, really, of this unit, when you think about the metabolism unit, is we really want to emphasize energy changes. We want to show the laws of thermodynamics appear at the end of this first section. We won't be getting into actually calculating anything with Gibbs in section 1. That gets into section 2. But being able to look at things from a graphic standpoint and understand where things are going. The other really critical component of this chapter is enzyme function and factors that influence enzyme function. If we look at the College Board breakdown in this area, they have enzyme structure, enzyme, how enzymes catalyze reactions, how the environment impacts enzyme function. So this area, we figure they approximate that this is going to take up, the estimate of this unit is like almost 15% of the course, and 3 sections of it dealt with enzymes. So that kind of leads you to what they're thinking is important. Being able to look at data and analyze it in regards to enzyme function is definitely going to be part of that. Okay, so us moving in here, there's some statements in here. We're going to kind of move through this, but it's just basically talking about the idea that biological systems will use free energy and building blocks to support life. You know what I mean? When you think about a characteristic of a living thing, and we list some of those really basic features and functions, they all rely on some type of energy transfer. Okay, so we're going to find that that's at the heart of bioenergetics and how we're able to sustain life. So, just kind of getting us thinking on the importance of this chapter and the content that's inside of it. One of the first things that we have to consider that there's hundreds of thousands of reactions that can take place inside the body, inside the cells, and your cells, we know there's limited availability of energy. We also know that those reactions need to take place in a safe temperature at a safe level. So having enzyme catalyzed reactions are going to be critical in each of those situations. We know that as long as an organism is alive, they're taking energy in to try to sustain that life. We can even see things that produce, producing a luminescence, for example, is something that's pretty obvious of an energy transformation and things that you would potentially see there. But those are all just general statements as we kind of jump into section 1, which looks at how we transform matter and how we transform energy in order to accomplish some of these objectives, which basically is maintaining life. All right, so section 1 tells us an organism's metabolism transforms matter and energy, and they're subject to the laws of thermodynamics. All right, so that sort of sounds like we're in chemistry or physics. And, there's an intersection of all the sciences at some point, and there's definitely reliance on different general concepts. So in this area, we think of metabolism. We're examining metabolism, and, we kind of throw metabolism around a lot of times. We might say, oh, that person has a really high metabolism or they have a slow metabolism. You're talking about the total net change of those energy interactions, the totality of all the chemical reactions that are taking place inside of an organism. So most of those metabolic pathways that we're taking a look at are based on how life is interacting with molecules within the cells and molecules in its surrounding environment. So we would say that that's an emergent property, and we have this constant flow of things that come in and go out of the body. So in bio, there's definitely lots of different metabolic pathways that we could potentially examine. Okay. I would say that in this unit, the 2 big ones are going to be cellular respiration and photosynthesis. Okay. So we would say that a metabolic pathway It's something where you start with a specific molecule and you end up with a certain product. And what we're going to find is that is rarely going to take place in a one-step process. It rarely is a one-step and you're done. Almost all of our reactions are going to be part of a pathway. Okay? So we can look at something, since we're in the energy unit of the course, we can look at a process like glycolysis. How many of you remember glycolysis? Some of you are like, yeah, I heard of that. I have bad memories of glycolysis maybe. But glycolysis is like one of the preliminary steps of cell respiration. It's whenever we take glucose in, and does anybody remember what the main remaining product at the end of glycolysis was? You take one molecule of glucose in, and at the end, the molecules that still retain most of the energy would be those two pyruvate molecules. And you're going to have you're going to have some ATP made, you're going to have some NADH coming off of that. But the point of it is glycolysis is a pathway, okay? And most of our pathways are going to have multiple steps that are catalyzed by different enzymes. So that's where we start to build that huge quantity of different enzymes that the body needs to function. So every reaction might have multiple sub-reactions within it that lead us to our final product. So this is a classic example, and this is about as simple as you can make it without giving you really any detail. But it shows us that, hey, we start off with this precursor molecule A, and the end product is D. But we don't go straight from A to D. We have multiple steps along the way. And each of those intermediate steps relies on an enzyme catalyzed reaction. So if you have a situation, and let's use glycolysis as our example, and one of those intermediate reactions, the enzyme is not functional. So now you've got a metabolic disorder that's going to impact that really critical process. Okay, I've done over the last couple of years. We'll do it because it's kind of fun. I have this case study that we do right after we cover respiration, and in this case study, you get to be the doctor. And the situation is we're going to look at blood data from multiple patients. So I'll put up a chart up there, and in the blood panel, it'll be analyzing different sugars that are present at their concentration level and what it should be versus what this person has. So you'll have like elevated levels of certain enzymes and elevated levels of certain substrates and lower levels than others. And you'll have to be able to go through there and say, okay, where's this person's problem at? And usually what we're finding is there's some enzyme somewhere in that process that's deficient in some way. So being able to pick that up. Do most people need to know the details of glycolysis? No. I mean, most people, even when they graduate with a bio degree or biochem degree, they don't specifically need to know that. But if you happen to be, the story of that case study is that the undergraduates working in a metabolic ward at a hospital. So the doctors that are focusing on those types of issues and problems, obviously they're experts in that area. All right, so here's what I would say. When we look at a chemical reaction, there's two different ways in which it could go, all right, in regards to whether you're building or tearing down. So we have the first one described here as a catabolic pathway. Catabolic pathways release energy by breaking down complex molecules into simpler compounds. Okay, so I'm going to tell you that we have two processes that we are somewhat familiar with, even though we don't necessarily recall the details at this point in the course. But we've got the process of, number one, photosynthesis. And number two, cell respiration. So let's use those two examples, respiration and photosynthesis. Which of those processes is catabolic? Which of those processes is catabolic? How many of you think number one? How many say number two? How many like not quite sure right now? That's a fair answer too. All right. So let's start with this. Does anybody know the reaction for photosynthesis? What do plants need in order to do photosynthesis? They need sunlight. What else do they need? All right. So they got carbon dioxide. What else do plants take in? They take in water, and they take in, like you said, the light. So we'll say sun. All right. And what do they produce as a result of that? Good old glucose and oxygen, right? To balance it, that we have 6 into that. So that's photosynthesis. If I did respiration, what happens in respiration? What do we start with? The opposite, right? So we start with that glucose molecule, and we take in some oxygen, and we get carbon dioxide, and we get water. Okay? So those are the two opposing reactions. Photosynthesis, respiration's in blue. Over here, we put in sunlight. Anything happening with respiration? Like, what's the point of doing respiration? In what form? Yes. Correct. The key objective of us executing cell respiration is to make usable energy. This molecule here, we're going to see there's a huge quantity of energy associated with it, a huge quantity, but our cells can't use that. They can't do anything with that specifically in terms of executing. Like you just covered the sodium potassium pump, right? That was a huge energy demanding process, but it uses the currency of ATP. All right, so let me go back to my question here. Which of these meets the definition of being catabolic? Releasing energy, breaking down complex into simple. So I would say if we're gonna look at this molecule is more complex than the outcome that we get there. All right? So that's a catabolic reaction. That's a catabolic reaction. Now, if we take, on the next slide, it asks about an anabolic reaction. So we might as well just talk about that while it's on here. If you have an anabolic reaction, you're building simple and simple. So here's a simple molecule, another one, with an investment of energy to build something more complex. Okay? So from my examples right here, we would have to say that a catabolic example would be cellular respiration. Us taking glucose in the presence of oxygen and breaking it down. Now, how many of you remember looking at graphs that look something like this in terms of free energy versus maybe time of reaction? And we'd say, all right, in this case right here, we're starting off with glucose and oxygen. How many of you are familiar with those graphs? Okay. That all goes in with those free energy changes and good Gibbs free energy stuff that we're going to look at. So if you're looking at a catabolic reaction, what we're going to find is that this is going to be our general trend. The energy of the products, of the reactants, I should say. So here's my reactants. Here's my products. The energy quantity of free energy is going to be lower after the reaction. So if it's lower, that means that energy is released, which is what we just said, energy is released. So that's a general trend for a reaction that's being described as being catabolic. Okay? we'll see that a lot in the next couple of days. Not today, but we'll see a lot of that in the future. All right. So the mention on the anabolic is it's consuming and it's building up. So we have a lot of examples which are anabolic. I gave you photosynthesis, but let's look at another one. When you're building the primary structure of a protein, you're taking monomers, which are the amino acids, and you're forming a polymer by, forming polypeptides out of that. So that requires energy. That's an anabolic process. So we can kind of go through lots of things in our anatomy and our biochemistry. And one of the other things that's pretty amazing and important is that the reactions, because they are not a one-step reaction, but they have multiple steps and they have enzymes all along the way, they can be fine-tuned. And we also have what's considered feedback mechanisms. So when something gets to a certain level, it can shut things off, all right? In order for our cells and our bodies to be as efficient as possible, we can't waste resources. So if you're talking about a process like making ATP and using resources to do that, you can't be inefficient and be successful. So having feedback pathways, and that's what bioenergetics is. It's the study of how we manage our resources, how we maximize our efficiency and do the best that we can with them. All right. Sometimes I have a note in my notes here. If you think about an uphill reaction or a downhill reaction, I mean, if I had a ramp and I had a ball, it can roll down the ramp without me investing energy in it. Okay, that's catabolic. It's just gonna go down. It's gonna go from a higher energy point to a lower energy point. If I do the uphill reaction, if I have my ramp and I want to get the ball to the top, I have to invest an outside source of energy. That's kind of like an anabolic process. So uphill versus downhill in terms of the metabolic landscape. All right. So the next section has a little bit of a physics twist to it. It just looks at some energy sources and types that are things that maybe don't necessarily 100% relate to the biological needs here. But we look at energy as a capacity to cause a change. And we know that there are different forms at which this can have the ability to do work. So one of the first types that we have on there is kinetic energy. So energy that's associated with motion. Related to kinetic energy is heat. Heat's more of a random motion. A lot of times, heat is viewed as an inefficiency, particularly from like an engineering standpoint. The engineers would try to minimize the inefficiency of an engine or other applications where heat would be generated. So that thermal energy is random movement of those molecules. And then, of course, we've got potential energy. Okay? Potential energy is energy associated with the position of where that particular substance is at. Now, I would say, some of these different things right here, you definitely would think they're, hey, maybe a little bit more focused towards the physics end of things. But this next one is really where it hits biology, and that's the chemical energy, chemical potential energy. So when we talked about us taking in glucose, and we said, hey, there's a certain amount of chemical potential associated with each molecule of glucose, we can't operate the sodium potassium pump or other mechanisms on glucose alone. We need to take that glucose and metabolize it into ATP, but there's a certain chemical potential associated with each mole of glucose that will allow us to do that. And that's what we need to look at, how that happens. And really, one of the biggest carryways of this slide and some of the things that we need to focus on, it ties into that first law of thermodynamics. And that is that we're not gonna create energy and we're not gonna destroy energy, but we're gonna be able to move it and convert it. It's all about energy conversions. So this picture is obviously a very basic set of descriptions as far as what's going on here, but it just shows us how energy transformations can take place. So at this point, he's maximum potential. As he's falling, he's reducing potential, increasing kinetic. As he climbs back up the ladder to get to the top of the platform, they're using chemical energy, converting it into kinetic energy to restore that system. So, there's definitely situations where some of the energy has transformed and gone in different directions. Some of the calories this person has consumed are being converted into heat. So not everything is 100% efficient. In fact, nothing is 100% efficient. All right. So if we look at the laws of energy transformation, we're talking about thermodynamics. Thermodynamics is how we study those changes and how things are going to operate. So sometimes in a study of thermodynamics, they want to set up these hypothetical environments that are closed systems. Okay? And a closed system, the best thing that I see, I don't see a lot of them today, but it's not uncommon to see the insulated bottles, the Yeti type cups and things of that sort, the thermos of sorts. What that's trying to do is it's trying to create a separation where one environment is isolated from the rest of the surrounding environment. And yes, there are different qualities and, abilities to isolate those different environments. It might be a marketing thing that, this cooler can hold ice for 7 days, or this cup will keep your beverage hot for 80 hours, or whatever they're advertising. Those are focusing on what's considered a closed system. The idea that you're going to isolate from your surroundings. Can you fully isolate? No, because eventually that ice melts or that coffee gets cold. But the idea is they're slowing down that flow of energy. And they're trying to isolate two things from one environment from the other. Do living things work like that? Would you think a human or any other living thing is a closed system? No. We're constantly taking in resources. I mean, it's one of the defining characteristics of being alive. If you don't need energy, if you don't need food anymore, you're not alive. So we are what's considered an open system, where energy and matter are transferring between the system and its surroundings. And as a result of that, we have this constant flow. So we have to be able to look at this and say, hey, we got energy coming in, we got energy going out. And that is true of all organisms. All organisms would meet the definition of being what we would consider an open system. And a perfectly closed system really doesn't exist. We can approximate it. We can try to get as close to that as possible with different engineered applications, but it's never going to be perfectly closed. So we're looking at how things will be able to, isolate between different environments. All right. So to wrap up this section, I'm introducing the two laws of thermodynamics that are relevant here, and that will conclude section 1. So the first one's really straightforward. The first law is just basically saying the energy of the universe is constant. What we have is not increasing or decreasing. So we can't create energy and we can't destroy energy. Whatever we have is what we have. So you can transfer it and you can transform it, but you can't create it, you can't destroy it. We often will say that's the conservation of energy. Law of conservation of mass and the law of conservation of energy. Now, law number 1 We're not creating energy. We're not destroying energy. But we also know that not all of that energy is going the way we want it to. Some of that energy is being released in forms of inefficiency. So the second law takes a look at the idea. It says during every energy transfer, some of that energy is unusable. It's unusable. It's given off as heat. Now, it obviously serves a purpose because we have homeostasis that we have to maintain a set, body temperature. So it's going to supplying a critical component of our balance, but it seems like it's lost. Okay, when you look at the values, like how much energy is in that glucose, how much energy is in the maximum amount of ATP that you put together, there's a big loss there. Okay, so according to that second law, for every transfer and transformation, there's an increase in entropy. Ooh, entropy. That goes with that chapter that you talked about there, right? Free energy and Gibbs and entropy. How many of you have heard of entropy before? Okay. Guys, entropy is this idea that there's a progression, there's a natural progression to disorder in the universe. It's a natural process. Here's what I would say. There's some easy, I know this is like oversimplifying something that's fairly complex, but we'll build on something from last chapter. Diffusion. If I took that perfume bottle and busted it on my desk and the smell started to make its way around the room to the different locations, we have in that particular setup evidence of entropy. We're moving to fill out that available space. Eventually we don't smell it anymore because the concentration has become so low and eventually so dispersed that we don't have that capability of sensing that. Things want to move towards disorder. They want to spread out. They want to fill up all the space. All right, so let's take an easy example. How much effort does it take for your room to become a mess? Not much, right? I mean, I know my classroom, it's not too bad this year because most of you are not turning papers in, but if I had papers coming in from 100-some people and stuff coming in and all that stuff, it starts to get real difficult. It takes energy and effort to keep it organized. So there's a natural progression for things to go into disorder. And what we're going to see is when we take a look at the energy processes, and entropy is definitely a component of that. So let's look at this right here. We've got predator-prey interaction. Okay, my setup here, I've got chemical energy. Food. My second law of thermodynamics, where is it showing through? We took that energy, we converted it into calories of a different type, and when it's going through there, it's using that food calories through respiration, so it's breaking it down, it's giving off waste products, it's giving off heat. So this is saying that total energy that was transferred from the prey to the predator, not every bit of that energy goes into their biomass. And you think about your living mass of what you are. When we take in our calories every day, we don't gain mass every day, right? You might gain mass for a couple of days in a row, or you might lose mass. But if you are maintaining constant mass, what that means is the number of calories you take in are balanced with how you're releasing and sustaining yourself and adding to that randomness outside. Okay, so the second law brings into concept the idea that we unavoidably take things that are organized. Okay, in that last picture, the organized carbohydrates, the organized proteins, the organized, components of a living thing, and we break them down into energy, and we break them down into heat, and we break them down into smaller products. All right. From a chemistry standpoint, what does spontaneous mean? Does it mean immediate? Doesn't mean immediate, right? So I got a question for you. If I have a graph where I'm saying that we have a certain amount of reactants right here, and this is their free energy. So my reactants right here have a quantity, let's say here's substance A and B, they're combined. There's a certain quantity of free energy. And we know that if we want to make something happen, we have to kind of push it to the transition. So we do need activation energy. So I input a little bit of activation energy and things of that sort. And as a result of that reaction, maybe we get this new combination of these substances. Is this reaction energetically favorable? Is this reaction spontaneous? Can this occur without an energy input? So when you look at this picture right here, you're saying, no, it doesn't. Because you're looking at this part and you're saying, well, we have to do this, right? We have to get those molecules agitated. We have to get them to the transition state. And then once they get to the transition state. So let me change this up. If I started right here and if this represented a ramp and I had a ball up here, I wouldn't have to invest any energy to get it to go down that ramp. If I looked right here and I went from this point to this point, I wouldn't have a net investment of energy. That's really what I should be saying. So if I compare where I'm at right now, my initial free energy value, and I compare that with my final free energy value, what have I done? I've gone down, which means that there was energy released. Okay? So in this case right here, this is a reaction that would be defined as being spontaneous. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's fast. It could be something that took seconds, or it could be something that took weeks or longer. So spontaneity just means that it can occur without that energy, the net energy input. It doesn't say that it's fast. Okay, so here it is. For a process to occur without an energy input, it has to increase the entropy of the universe. So the graph I just showed you, as we went through there, and at the beginning of the session, we talked about respiration. We said you took in glucose, you took in oxygen, you got carbon dioxide, you have water, and you give off ATP. Glucose was more ordered. Carbon dioxide and oxygen, less ordered. So by doing that reaction, we increased the entropy. We created more randomness, smaller particles, less complex. Okay? I know the concept itself is a little bit confusing when we start to look at it, but the progression of order and disorder, as we kind of wrap this up, it says cells create ordered structures from less ordered material. Think about the order that a cell has. You've got these compartmentalization components. You have the specific, membrane structures. You have very specific proteins and other interactions like carbohydrates and some of the lipids that build these cells. That's complex. That's complex. It's not just a random collection of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. It's taking raw material and making it more ordered. So in order to do that, organisms have to go through there. It says they replace ordered forms of matter and energy with less ordered forms. So we take in energy to build order, and then we release a less ordered form in that particular case. So respiration would be a good example of us taking the glucose and breaking it down, using that energy and giving us less ordered components that come off of it. If you look at an ecosystem as a whole, it says energy flows through an ecosystem. It all starts with the light. So you have the sunlight that comes in. It drives the producers to produce the initial calories. You've got the primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary. At the end, everything coming off of that's heat. So it's all just a matter of transformations. And most of the time, what you're doing is you're giving off those changes. All right. So the last point here, this is kind of focusing in here. It says the evolution of more complex organisms does not violate the second law of thermodynamics. So that statement was put in there out of your book and some other sources because a lot of times people use this. They say, if the natural progression is we move towards disorder, how is it possible that the earliest forms of life were so simple and disordered compared to the more complex modern forms of life? And the idea behind that is that disorder may decrease in an organism. So like in small areas, like in a living thing or in a cell, there could be a reduction in that disorder, but at the expense of the overall increase in disorder of the universe. So in other words, as we consume calories, we consume food, resources, and other things, we build more order, but the byproducts, the respiration byproducts and everything else contribute to that disorder. All right, so a lot of that that thought process, it's a little bit abstract. Tomorrow, when we get into this, we'll actually start looking at real reactions and try to predict whether or not it's spontaneous and how that's ultimately going to